They made fun of the old man in work boots, but fell silent when they saw the power. He was hiding. The morning arrived at Martinez and Sons auto shop like all the others, with the smell of diesel oil mixed with reheated coffee, with the metallic clang of tools, and with the laughter of younger mechanics echoing between the service bays. But on that Monday in August, something different was about to happen, something that would forever change how those men saw the world around them. Robert arrived at 6:30 in the morning, half an hour before the official shift began. He always did this. His work boots, worn and patched in at least 3 different places, left marks of decades of use on the concrete floor. The navy blue coveralls were clean but faded by time and countless washings. His grey hair, cut simply, was combed with care. There was a quiet dignity in this 68-year-old man, a dignity that others couldn't or wouldn't see. "Look who's here," murmured Diego, the youngest on the team at just 23, with an arrogance that seemed to grow daily. The dinosaur with his museum boots. Lucas, his constant companion in mockery, let out a sharp laugh. "Man, those boots must be as old as my dad. I bet he's been wearing them since cars still had carburetors." "Since they had hand cranks, you mean," added Andre, joining the chorus. "Old Robert probably helped invent the wheel." Laughter filled the shop as Robert walked calmly to his locker. He showed no sign of having heard the comments. He opened the metal compartment with slow but precise movements, stored his thermal lunch container on the top shelf, and retrieved his personal tools, a set he'd maintained for over 40 years, each piece polished by constant use, each handle worn by the pressure of his hands over countless repairs. Marcus, the shop supervisor, watched the scene from his small glass-enclosed office. He was 35 and had been in the position for only 2 years. He knew he should intervene, that he should put a stop to those daily provocations, but he always hesitated. Robert never complained, never responded, simply continued his work with the same calm efficiency as always. Perhaps, Marcus thought in his moments of justification, the old man was already used to it. Perhaps he didn't really care. But Marcus was wrong. Robert cared. Each comment pierced his skin like a thin metal splinter, too small to cause visible bleeding, but painful enough to remind him it was there. He had simply learned, over an entire lifetime, that some battles weren't worth the expenditure of energy, that words thrown into the wind often reveal more about who speaks them than about who receives them. Martinez and Sons Auto Shop had a history that few there knew completely. Founded in 1952 by Antonio Martinez, the grandfather of the current owners, it had started as a small garage that repaired bicycles and motorcycles. Over time it had grown, adapted, transformed into one of the largest automotive maintenance centers in the region. But with growth came impersonality, the loss of that human connection that characterized old-fashioned family businesses. Robert had arrived there in 1979, when he was still a young man of 22, newly married and full of dreams. He'd been hired by Antonio Martinez himself, who had seen something special in the young man, a rare combination of natural technical skill and genuine passion for the craft. "You have golden hands, son," old Antonio had said on that first day. "Hands that hear what engines want to say." And it was true. Robert had an almost mystical gift for diagnosing problems. While other mechanics depended on increasingly sophisticated electronic equipment, he simply needed to listen to the engine running, feel the vibrations through his calloused hands, observe the color of the exhaust smoke. It was as if he spoke a language that cars understood, a silent communication between man and machine. For decades, Robert had been the shop's invisible star. When an important customer arrived with a problem no one else could solve, it was to Robert that Antonio Martinez sent the car. When younger mechanics encountered automotive puzzles that defied their understanding, it was Robert who discreetly guided them, teaching without ever making the other feel diminished. But years passed, Antonio Martinez died, and his sons took over the business with a different vision, more corporate, more focused on numbers than on people. The grandchildren now managed day-to-day operations, and for them, Robert was simply an old employee who cost the payroll dearly due to his years of service. The boots the young men ridiculed told a story they would never bother to know. Robert had bought them in 1985, when his daughter Clara was born. They were expensive boots at the time, a significant investment that he and his wife Maria had planned carefully. "I need good boots," he had explained to his wife that night, holding the newborn baby in his arms. "Boots that last, because every penny I save is one more penny for her future." And those boots lasted. They survived 40 years of hard work, of accidental crushes by heavy machines, of battery acid splashes, of countless hours standing on cold concrete. Robert resoled them when necessary, patched tears with special glue, treated the leather with oil regularly. Not from greed or lack of resources to buy new ones, but because those boots were part of his history, silent witnesses to his journey. On that August morning, Robert's first job was a 1987 Chevrolet Caprice, a classic model that had arrived at the shop making a strange noise in the engine. The owner, a white-haired gentleman named Joaquin, was visibly worried. "This car belonged to my father," he explained to Marcus at reception. "It has sentimental value. I need someone who really understands these old models." Marcus nodded and assigned the job to Diego, the youngest mechanic, thinking it would be a good learning opportunity. "Just diagnose it and bring me a quote before doing anything," he instructed. 2 hours later, Diego was still scratching his head, looking at the exposed engine with a confused expression. He had already tried 3 different diagnoses using the electronic scanner, all inconclusive. The noise persisted, a rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the engine's innards, but defied precise location. "It's difficult, boss," Diego admitted when Marcus came to check the progress. "The scanner shows nothing wrong, but there's clearly something happening there." Robert was working in the adjacent bay, changing the oil in an ordinary sedan. He had heard the Caprice arrive, immediately recognized the characteristic sound of that 6-cylinder engine, and also identified the problem just by the sound. But he said nothing. He had learned that unsolicited offers of help were often received as insults by the younger ones, as if he were insinuating their incapacity. He continued his work, methodically checking fluid levels, inspecting components, doing what he had done thousands of times before, but always with the same care, the same attention to detail. There was no room for haste or carelessness in the craft, as he understood it. Each car entrusted to his care was a sacred responsibility, someone's means of transportation, perhaps an entire family's work tool. "Hey, Grandpa," called Lucas, passing by Robert's bay. "When are you going to retire and leave space for people who really know how to work? Those old methods of yours don't work in the modern world anymore." Robert wiped his hands on a cloth, looked at Lucas with calm, dark eyes. "Respect never goes out of style, young man. Neither does humility." "Humility?" Lucas let out a laugh. "Is that what you call being stuck in the past? Using old boots and dinosaur tools? I call it valuing what works, what stands the test of time." Robert returned his gaze to the engine before him. "But you'll learn that for yourself, eventually, or you won't, and that will say more about you than about me." Lucas was about to retort, but something in Robert's serene tone made him hesitate. There was a solidity in that old man, a quiet certainty that was difficult to shake. Muttering something inaudible, Lucas went on his way. The day advanced at its usual pace. Cars came and went. Problems were diagnosed and solved. Parts were replaced. At 11 in the morning, a black Mercedes-Benz, a recent and obviously expensive model, parked in the customer area. A tall man, wearing an impeccable suit despite the heat, stepped out of the vehicle and walked directly to reception. "I need to speak with the manager," he said to the attendant, his voice carrying that natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "It's urgent." Marcus was called and immediately recognized the visitor. It was Carlos Mendez, president of Mendez Development, one of the largest construction companies in the region. His corporate card decorated the reception wall among the shop's VIP clients. "Mr. Mendez, what a pleasure to receive you," Marcus greeted, extending his hand. "Any problem with your vehicle?" "Not exactly." Carlos Mendez had a serious expression. "I need to speak with Robert. Does he still work here?" The name fell into the environment like a stone in still water. Marcus blinked, confused. "Robert? The mechanic, Robert?" "Yes, Robert Silva. Grey hair, around 70 years old, has worked here for decades. He's the one I need to see." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing to process this unexpected situation. Why would one of the shop's most important clients be looking specifically for Robert? The old mechanic, everyone treated like disposable relic. Of course. I'll call him immediately." Marcus hurried out toward the work bays, where Robert continued working on the sedan. "Robert!" he called, and there was something different in his tone now, a deference that hadn't existed before. "There's a customer wanting to speak with you, Carlos Mendez from the development company." Robert raised his eyes, and for a brief moment something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but perhaps recognition, memory. He cleaned his hands carefully, removed his work apron, and walked toward reception, his worn boots making that familiar sound against the concrete. Diego, Lucas, and Andre stopped what they were doing to observe. Something unusual was happening, and natural curiosity drove them to witness it. Robert entered reception and met Carlos Mendez's gaze. For a long moment the two men simply observed each other. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, the powerful businessman took 2 steps forward and hugged the old mechanic. "Robert," said Carlos, and his voice was loaded with emotion that seemed out of place in this man so obviously accustomed to control. "I finally found you, after all these years." Robert returned the embrace, his calloused hands patting gently on the businessman's back. "Carlitos," he said softly, using a nickname that clearly dated back to another time, another context. "You've grown so much. Look at the man you've become." Marcus, the attendant, and the mechanics who could see the scene from the work area watched with wide eyes, their minds trying to process that impossible interaction. How did old Robert, with his patched boots and faded coveralls, know one of the city's most powerful businessmen? And why was that businessman treating him with such reverence? Carlos Mendez stepped back, discreetly wiping his eyes. "I need to talk to you." "Is there a place where we can speak privately?" Marcus quickly offered his office, and the two men headed there, closing the door behind them. Through the glass, the shop employees could see them talking, but couldn't hear what they were saying. Carlos gestured animatedly. Robert listened with his characteristic attention, nodding occasionally. "What the hell is happening?" Diego murmured to Lucas. "I have no idea, man. Maybe the old guy fixed his car once, and he was impressed. Nobody hugs a mechanic like that just because he changed the oil well," Andre retorted, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. "There's something more happening here." Inside the office, a story was being told. A story that went back to 1992, 33 years in the past. "I was 10 years old," Carlos Mendez was saying, sitting in the visitor's chair while Robert remained standing, leaning against the desk. "My father had just died. Cancer, quick and brutal. He was a truck driver, worked 18 hours a day to support the family. When he died, he left nothing but debts and an old truck that barely worked." Robert listened, his hands clasped in front of his body, his face showing the compassion that had always been his trademark. "My mother didn't know what to do," Carlos continued. "She cleaned houses, but the money barely covered rent. We were 3 months behind. The landlord was about to evict us. She had a desperate idea. Sell my father's truck. It was the only valuable thing we had." Carlos paused, the emotion evident in his voice. "But the truck was broken. It had problems with the transmission, the engine, everything. No shop wanted to take on the job because my mother had no money to pay. We went to 7 different places. Everyone turned their backs on us. Until we came here, Robert said softly, remembering that rainy winter day, the thin woman with desperate eyes and the small boy holding her hand. Until we came here, Carlos echoed, and you received us. You listened to my mother's story, looked at that destroyed truck, and you know what you said? Robert smiled slightly. I said that every problem has a solution. The question is finding the right path. You worked on that truck for 3 weeks. In your spare time, after work hours, on weekends, you used reconditioned parts when you could, improvised creative solutions where necessary, and when my mother asked how much the service was, how much she owed you, I said it was already paid, that her gratitude was payment enough. Carlos Mendez stood up, walking to the window overlooking the shop. That truck ran for another 8 years. My mother was able to sell it for a fair price, paid the debts, pulled us back from the brink of eviction. She started a small sewing business, and I was able to continue in school. I finished high school, got a scholarship to university, graduated in civil engineering. He turned to Robert, and there were tears in his eyes now, without shame or attempt to hide them. Everything I have today, all the success of my company, it all starts with what you did for us that day. You saved our family, Robert, and I've spent the last few years trying to find you to say this personally. Robert felt something tightening in his chest, that sensation that comes when we are reminded that our actions, even those that seem small and insignificant, can resonate through time in ways we never imagine. You owe me nothing, Carlitos. I did what any decent person would do. But not everyone does, Carlos insisted. 7 shops turned their backs on us before you. 7 people chose their profits over our humanity. You chose differently, and I want to do something in return. He pulled an envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and extended it to Robert. This is a formal offer. I want to hire you as a technical consultant for my company. We're expanding our fleet of vehicles and heavy machinery, and we need someone who really understands these things, not just technically, but on a deeper level. Robert looked at the envelope without taking it. Carlos, I appreciate the gesture, but the salary is 3 times what you earn here. Flexible hours, because I know you've worked hard your whole life. Complete health insurance for you and your family, and mainly respect. The kind of respect you've always deserved, but haven't always received. The words hung in the air between them. Through the office glass, they could see the mechanics trying to discreetly peek at what was happening, curiosity stamped on every face. Can I think about it? Robert finally asked. Of course, but there's one more thing. Carlos took out his phone and showed some photos. Remember my mother? She passed away last year, but she lived to see my company grow, to see the grandchildren she never thought she'd have. She always talked about you, Robert. She always said there were angels on earth, and that you were one of them. Robert swallowed hard, remembering that gentle woman who fought so bravely for her son. I'm sorry for your loss. She lived well, she lived happily, thanks to you. Carlos put away his phone and extended his hand. Think about my offer, but regardless of whether you accept or not, I needed you to know. You changed the course of an entire life with a single act of kindness. That's real power, Robert, power that no amount of money can buy. The 2 men shook hands, and then Carlos did something unexpected. He opened the office door and asked for everyone's attention in the shop. Mechanics, reception staff, even waiting customers stopped to listen. I want all of you to know, said Carlos Mendez, his voice firm and clear, that this man here, Robert Silva, is the reason my company exists today. 33 years ago, when my family was desperate and no one else would help, he extended his hand to us. He fixed my late father's truck without charging a penny, and in doing so, saved my family from misery. The silence that fell over the shop was so dense you could hear the distant hum of traffic on the street. Today, I'm president of a multi-million-dollar company. I employ more than 300 people. I've built buildings throughout this city. And it all started because a good-hearted man chose kindness over profit, compassion over indifference. Carlos placed his hand on Robert's shoulder. This man is a giant. And any of you would be lucky to learn a fraction of what he knows, not just about cars, but about being human. Diego felt his face heat with shame. Lucas stared fixedly at his own boots. New, expensive, bought more for style than functionality. Andre swallowed hard, remembering all the times he had mocked the old mechanic. Carlos Mendez waved goodbye and left the shop, but his presence continued hovering like a truth that could no longer be ignored. Robert quietly returned to his work bay. He picked up his tools, adjusted the position of the light over the engine he was working on, and resumed his task exactly where he had left off, as if nothing had happened, as if his entire life hadn't just been validated before the eyes of all who had diminished him. But something had changed in the shop. The air was different, charged with a new and uncomfortable awareness. Marcus was the first to approach. "Robert," he began, and there was a humility in his voice that hadn't existed in all the 2 years he'd been in the supervisor position. I didn't know about what you did for that family. About many things, it seems." Robert looked up, his hands still working automatically, adjusting a hose. "You had no reason to know, Marcus. It wasn't something I did expecting recognition. Even so, I should have treated you better. I should have demanded that others treat you better. Respect can't be demanded, only earned. And it's not earned through fear or authority, but through consistent actions over time." Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing those words. "Are you going to accept his offer, the consultancy?" Robert paused in his work, considering. "I don't know yet. This shop has been my home for 46 years. It's hard to leave behind something that's part of who you are. You deserve something better than what you've received here. Maybe, or maybe there are still lessons to be taught, learnings to be shared." Robert returned his attention to the engine. "Either way, I have work to do now. That Caprice in Bay 3 is still without a diagnosis?" "Yes. Diego has been trying to figure out the problem for hours. If he wants, I can take a look. Sometimes a second pair of eyes helps." Marcus almost laughed at the irony. "I think he'd love your help, Robert. I'll call him." When Diego approached Robert's bay, his hands trembled slightly, and he couldn't meet the older man's gaze. The arrogance that had characterized him had evaporated completely. "Mr. Robert," he began, and the Mr. was new, loaded with respect that was finally being offered. I need to apologize for the things I said, for the jokes, for the—" Robert raised a hand, interrupting him gently. "Diego, you're young. Young people make mistakes. The question isn't whether you'll err, but whether you'll learn from those mistakes." He wiped his hands on his cloth. "Tell me about that Caprice. What have you tried?" For the next hour, Robert worked with Diego on the classic car. But he didn't just solve the problem, he taught. He explained why the specific noise indicated wear on the valve rockers, how to identify sound patterns that electronic scanners couldn't detect, how to use all the senses, hearing, touch, even smell, to diagnose automotive problems. "Technology is wonderful," Robert said, while adjusting components with experienced hands. "But the machine hasn't replaced the mechanic. It complements him. You need to understand the fundamental principles first. Only then does technology make sense." Diego absorbed every word like a sponge. For the first time since he'd started working there, he was genuinely learning, not just executing memorized procedures. Lucas and Andre watched from a distance. Finally, Lucas gathered the courage to approach. "Mr. Robert," he said, and the change in tone was obvious, almost painful. I was an idiot. Those things I said about your boots, about you being too old." "Lucas," Robert interrupted, turning to face him directly. "Do you know why I wear these boots?" Lucas shook his head negatively. "I bought these boots the day my daughter was born. It was 1985. I was a young mechanic, not much older than you are now, and I was terrified with the responsibility of being a father. But I was also full of hope, full of determination to build a good life for her." Robert lifted one foot, showing the worn boots under the shop light. These boots saw me work double shifts when my wife got sick. They saw me stand firm when the shop went through hard times and it seemed we'd have to close. They saw me teach my daughter to change oil when she was 12 years old. They saw me dance at her wedding. They saw me meet my grandchildren. He lowered his foot. These boots tell the story of my life, Lucas. Each patch is a memory, each scratch a lesson learned. I could buy new boots tomorrow. I have enough money saved for that. But I choose to wear these because they remind me of where I came from, of the battles I won, of the people I loved. Lucas had tears in his eyes now. I'm sorry. I judged without knowing. You're young, Robert repeated, and there was gentleness in his voice, not accusation. And the world teaches young people to value the new, the shiny, the modern. But part of growing up is learning that real value isn't on the surface. It's in what resists, in what remains, in what proves true through the test of time. Andre approached as well, and the three young mechanics stood there in Robert's bay, listening as he shared stories from decades in the profession. He spoke about the mistakes he'd made when he was young, about the mentors who had guided him, about the importance of always putting the customer first, not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Each car that enters through that door, Robert said, gesturing toward the shop entrance, carries within it someone's life. Maybe it's a mother's means of taking her children to school. Maybe it's a salesman's work tool who needs to visit clients. Maybe it's the only luxury a retiree was able to save money to buy. He looked each of the young men in the eyes. When you treat that car with respect, when you do the work right even when no one is watching, when you're honest about what needs to be done instead of trying to sell unnecessary services, you're treating that life with respect. And that matters. It matters more than any salary, more than any promotion. Joaquin, the Caprice owner, returned to the shop at the end of the afternoon to pick up his car. Marcus received him personally, explaining that the problem had been identified and resolved. Was it young Diego who did the service? Joaquin asked. With guidance from Robert, our senior mechanic, Marcus admitted. Robert. Joaquin's face lit up. Robert Silva still works here? He fixed this same car 20 years ago, when my father was still alive. It was as if a floodgate had been opened. Throughout the afternoon, several old customers passed by the shop, some by coincidence, others having heard through the small communication network that exists in every community. Each one had a story about Robert, the man who had fixed their car on the roadside when it broke down in the middle of a storm. The mechanic who had stayed late to ensure a pregnant woman could get to the hospital on time. The professional who had discovered a serious safety problem that another mechanic had ignored, potentially saving lives. Diego, Lucas, and Andre listened to story after story, each one revealing layers of the man they had treated with such disdain. Each narrative was a stone added to the weight of the shame they carried, but also a lesson about the kind of person they could aspire to be. When the shift ended at 6 in the evening, Robert cleaned his tools with his usual care, stored them in his organized locker, and prepared to leave. The three young mechanics waited for him at the exit. Mr. Robert, Diego began, and the other two stood at his side in silent solidarity. We wanted to know, if it's not too much to ask, if you could, maybe, teach us, for real, not just about mechanics, but about doing this the right way. Robert looked at the three young faces before him. He saw in them something he recognized, the desire to be better, to learn, to grow. It was the same desire he had felt when he was their age, when Antonio Martinez had given him his first chance. Arrive half an hour early tomorrow, he said simply. We'll start with the basics. That night, Robert drove home in the same car he'd driven for 15 years, a simple but well-maintained sedan. The familiar streets passed by the window as he reflected on the day's events. His wife, Maria, waited for him at home. She always waited. Even after 43 years of marriage, she still stood at the window watching until she saw him park. "How was your day?" she asked when he entered, as she asked every day. Robert kissed her, took off the worn boots at the entrance, a habit he maintained to not bring dirt from the shop into the house, and told her about Carlos Mendez, about the offer, about the subtle but profound change he had felt happen in the shop. "Are you going to accept the consultancy?" Maria asked, serving the dinner she had prepared. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to. It's an incredible opportunity, and the money would be good for our retirement, to leave something more for Clara and the children." He paused, moving the food around on his plate. "But another part of me feels there's still work to do at the shop. Those young men today, they were ready to learn, really learn, and I can't help but think that maybe that's my purpose now, not just fixing cars, but shaping people." Maria smiled, that wise smile of someone who knows their partner better than any other person in the world. "You've always been a teacher, Robert, even when you didn't realize it. It's part of who you are." They ate dinner in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. Afterward, Robert sat in his favorite armchair, another well-used but carefully maintained piece, and picked up the envelope Carlos Mendez had given him. Inside, besides the formal job offer, there was a handwritten letter. "Robert, my mother used to say there are 3 kinds of people in the world: those who take, those who watch, and those who give. You've always been a giver. When you gave your time, your skills, and your kindness to our family, you planted a seed that grew into a tree large enough to shelter many other people. Today, I employ 300 people. That means 300 families who have food on the table, roofs over their heads, hope for the future. And each of these families exists in part because of what you did 33 years ago. But more than that, I try to live by the values you demonstrated. I treat my employees with respect. I pay fair wages. When someone goes through difficulties, I remember my father's truck and find ways to help. You didn't just save my family, Robert. You taught me how to live. The offer I made is genuine and will remain open for as long as you need. But even if you decide not to accept it, I want you to know this: you are one of the most powerful men I've ever known. Not because of the money you have or the position you hold, but because of the impact you've had on other lives. This world desperately needs more people like you. With eternal gratitude, Carlos." Robert folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and closed his eyes. He thought about his life, about the choices he had made, about the paths he had taken. He had never sought power in the traditional sense. He never wanted wealth or fame. He simply tried day after day to do what was right, treat people with dignity, do honest work, help when he could, and yet somehow that had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. The next morning, Robert arrived at the shop half an hour early, as he always did. But this time, he wasn't alone. Diego, Lucas, and Andre were already there, waiting. They brought notebooks, pens, expressions of genuine determination. Over the next weeks, a transformation happened at Martinez & Sons auto shop. Robert began dedicating part of each day to teaching the young mechanics, not just repair techniques, but work philosophy, how to listen to customers, how to diagnose beyond obvious symptoms, how to maintain integrity even when it would be easier not to. The change wasn't just in the apprentices. Marcus began leading differently, treating employees as people instead of resources. The shop's culture itself changed. Less mockery, fewer shortcuts, more care, more respect. Customers began to notice. Online reviews improved. People began recommending the shop, not just for technical quality, but for the treatment they received. "They really care," wrote one customer. "You can see that their work is more than just a job." 3 months after Carlos Mendez's visit, Antonio Martinez's grandchildren, the current shop owners, scheduled a meeting with Robert. They offered him a position as technical director with significantly better salary, flexible hours, and official responsibility for training new mechanics. "We realized," said Fernando Martinez, the eldest grandson, "that we've been treating this shop only as a business. But our grandfather built it as something more, as a place where people mattered, where quality meant something. You embody those values, Robert, and we want you to help us recover them." Robert accepted the position, but under one condition: that part of his efforts be dedicated to an apprenticeship program for young people from underserved communities, giving them the same opportunity Antonio Martinez had given him decades ago. The Martinezes agreed immediately. As for Carlos Mendez's offer, Robert responded with his own letter, thanking him deeply but explaining his decision to stay. "There are seeds I still need to plant here," he wrote, "and I've learned that real power isn't in how much you earn, but in how much you can give. You're already doing wonderful work spreading kindness through your company. Let me do the same here, in my small corner of the world." Carlos understood completely. The two men began meeting regularly for lunches, developing a friendship that transcended their shared history. Carlos frequently sent young people from his company to learn from Robert, not just about mechanics, but about leadership, integrity, character. Diego, Lucas, and Andre became the most dedicated students Robert had ever had. Diego eventually specialized in classic cars, becoming known throughout the region for his skill in restorations. Lucas developed expertise in complex diagnostics, using the combination of modern technology and old intuition that Robert had taught him. Andre became interested in the educational side, helping Robert train new apprentices. None of them ever mocked worn boots again. In fact, Diego began wearing his own father's work boots, already worn but functional. "There's history in these boots," he explained when a customer asked, "and history is worth more than appearance." Robert's daughter, Clara, was deeply touched when she learned the whole story. "Dad," she said, visiting the shop with her two teenage children, "you've always been my hero, but I didn't know how much of a hero you were to so many other people too." "I'm not a hero, daughter. I just did what seemed right at the moment." "But that's exactly what makes someone special, isn't it?" She hugged her father, that man with patched boots and an immense heart. Doing the right thing consistently, even when no one is watching, even when there's no recognition expected. Robert's grandchildren, Peter and Sophia, began spending summers working at the shop. Peter, 16, showed natural talent for mechanics. Sophia, 14, became more interested in the administrative side, asking questions about management and customer relations. Both absorbed their grandfather's lessons with the same reverence as Diego, Lucas, and Andre. "You're learning a valuable profession," Robert told them on a summer afternoon, the three of them working together to replace a car's clutch. "But more important than the profession are the principles. Treat people as you would like to be treated. Do work you can be proud of, and always remember, true power isn't in how much you can accumulate, but in how much you can contribute." 5 years passed since that August day when Carlos Mendez had entered the shop, looking for Robert. Martinez & Sons auto shop flourished under the new direction, becoming a reference not just in technical quality, but in human excellence. Robert, now 73, finally began considering retirement, not because he was tired of the work, but because he felt he had fulfilled his mission. He had trained a new generation of mechanics who carried with them not just technical skills, but solid values. On the day of his official retirement, the shop organized a surprise party. Old customers came from afar to participate. Carlos Mendez arrived with a delegation of his executives. The owners prepared speeches, but it was Diego who spoke on behalf of the mechanics. "Mr. Robert," he began, his voice firm but loaded with emotion. "When you first arrived here in the 70s, this shop gained more than an exceptional mechanic. It gained a moral compass. And when I, Lucas, and Andre almost lost you through our own stupidity and arrogance, we learned the most important lesson of our lives." He paused, looking at Robert's boots, now retired and displayed in a glass case that the owners had commissioned, a permanent tribute to their history. "You taught us that real power isn't in what you wear or what you possess. It's in how you treat people when no one is watching. It's in doing the right work, even when the shortcut is available. It's in planting seeds of kindness and trusting they'll grow in places we may never see. There was prolonged applause. Robert, never comfortable being the center of attention, felt humbly grateful for that recognition, but more so for the confirmation that his life had meant something, that his efforts weren't in vain. That night, at home with Maria, Robert reflected on his journey, from the boots he'd bought when his daughter was born to the values he'd tried to embody in each day of work. From the scared but hopeful young mechanic he'd been to the respected mentor he'd become. "Do you have regrets?" Maria asked, nestled beside him on the couch. Robert thought carefully before responding. "Regrets? Not of the big ones. I could have made more money if I'd accepted some offers over the years. I could have pursued promotions more aggressively, but then I wouldn't have been myself. And the rewards I received, seeing people grow, knowing I made a difference, are worth more than any bank account." He looked at his hands, calloused by decades of hard work, marked by small scars from a life spent under the hood of countless cars. These hands fixed engines, but more importantly, they touched lives. And in the end, I think that's what matters. Not how much you accumulated, but how much you shared. Not how high you climbed, but how many people you helped climb too. Maria kissed his forehead, that simple gesture of affection she'd repeated thousands of times throughout their marriage. "You're a good man, Robert Silva, a truly good man, and I'm grateful for every day I've spent by your side." The story of Robert and his worn boots spread beyond the shop. Local newspapers covered it, then a regional television network. The story touched something deep in people, a collective need to be reminded that kindness matters, that integrity has value, that the choices we make in small moments can resonate through decades. Young mechanics began visiting the shop specifically to learn from the team Robert had trained. Technical schools invited Diego, Lucas, and Andre to speak about professional ethics. Carlos Mendez established a scholarship in Robert's name, helping young people from underserved communities learn technical trades. The seed Robert had planted when he chose to help a desperate family in 1992 had grown into a tree so large that it now provided shade for hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and it would continue growing long after he was gone, because the principles he lived, kindness, integrity, service, were timeless and self-propagating. In the afternoons of his retirement, Robert frequently visited the shop, not to work, but to observe and occasionally offer advice when requested. He saw Diego patiently teaching a young apprentice, using exactly the same methods Robert had taught him. He saw Lucas treating an elderly customer with respect and dignity, taking extra time to explain the problem in terms she could understand. He saw Andre leading a training session, talking about the importance of doing the work right, for the right reason. And in these moments, Robert felt a deep and quiet satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of personal achievements or public recognition, but something deeper. The satisfaction of knowing his life had made a difference, that the values he lived by would continue far beyond his own existence. The boots, now in their glass case in the shop reception, became a symbol, not of poverty or stubbornness as some initially thought, but of something much deeper, of history, of dignity, of values that transcend fashion or trend. Each visitor to the shop saw those boots and heard the story behind them, and each one took something of that story with them, a reminder that real value doesn't reside in superficial appearances, but in enduring character. Robert Silva may have departed, but his power, the true power to transform lives through consistent kindness and unwavering integrity, remains eternal and ever-growing, like waves that continue expanding long after the stone that initiated them has disappeared into the depths. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in authority or wealth, but in the quiet dedication of those who choose goodness when no one is watching, in hands that heal machines and hearts. in boots that carry stories of sacrifice and service, in lives that plant gardens they may never see bloom, trusting that kindness is never truly lost. It simply transforms, multiplies, and returns to us in forms beyond our imagining.